Well, thank you everyone for joining us today on our 41st episode of Ideas and Lives. I'm Bob Lerman, social policy economist, and my colleague is
Zvi Bodie, financial economist.
And today we're happy to interview um, our friend and in some cases relative, Jonathan Treussard, who is younger than many of the people that we interview, but still, even at his young age, has had an interesting career. And we'll get started. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. I love being called young. This is good. This is a good start.
So, Jonathan, tell us about where you grew up and what your parents did and what kind of atmosphere it was growing up.
Sure. Well, I grew up right outside of Paris, France. My mother is a lifelong public educator. She started as a biology teacher in middle school. Did that for a long time through the better part of my early youth. And then by the time I was 10, roughly, I think she burnt out on being in the classroom, which is completely understandable. And so she moved into leadership. She ended up being a principal at middle schools in Paris, in and around Paris. So my mother was an educator, is an educator, now retired. And my father was an entrepreneur, just, ran a long list, long series of businesses, small businesses. Not always successful, but always interesting. One of the things that my dad did in the 80s when I was a kid was he basically ran an import-export business, is the best way I could describe it, between France and Mali, a former French colony in Africa, where he would send containers full of old car parts and truck parts to Mali, where they could be put to good use, and sell them to the local taxi drivers and truck drivers and so on and so forth. And then to make good use of the space for the container going back to Western Europe, he would fill those with mangoes and then sell the mangoes all over Paris. So that was one
I love
fun
mangoes.
Yeah, I love mangoes too. I still do, and when I eat mango, I think about my dad. So that's the family. As I
This
said, grew up in
area
Paris.
outside of Paris, what was it, like a suburb? What kind of housing and
Well, always, yeah. So
density?
always, yeah. So Paris, and of course there is the kind of the formal city of Paris, and then there are the suburbs around it. But in a lot of ways, Paris is not unlike Boston, where its fee is, where the distinction between formal Boston and the Boston suburbs is a little unclear sometimes. And so I grew up I would say to people I grew up in Paris, but that would be formally incorrect, though it was factually kind of my reality. I was born in Drancy, which is on the northern parts of Paris, very working class, post-war. And then eventually, of course, kind of became one of the ghettos, kind of in the late 70s and early 80s, with a lot of immigrant population, so on and so forth. Where the riots took place in the early 2000s.
Oh yeah.
And actually, shockingly, is I'm reading now. Of course, I've been gone for a long time, but I'm reading that that part of Paris is really kind of revitalized, and the efforts of building the sports complexes and hosting the Olympics around there and all that has really helped. But that's kind of where I was born, and the first 10 years of my life. Again, my mother was an educator, and part of the deal when you're a public servant, and in particularly a principal for a public school in France, is you get housing for wherever you're dispatched. And so when I was 10 years old, my mom got a job at a middle school that was in a very posh neighborhood called Meudon, which, in a lot of ways you can think of it as the Upper East Side Paris, and so I spent the back end of my youth in a very green, leafy, intellectual suburb of Paris, where everybody was an attorney, a doctor, the editor of Le Monde. I mean, you name it. So I went from a very working class kind of first paragraph in my history to a very intellectual and more elevated experience when
And
I was
was
getting.
that reflected in your high school?
Yeah, so um, the answer is yes. I ended up going to arguably one of the best high schools immediately outside of Paris. Again, there are 4 or 5 very famous high schools inside the walls, but I went to La Canal, which is one of the arguably the best high school just outside of Paris. And I ended up going there because my mother knew how to kind of get me into the right school. So by the time I got to high school, actually, my parents had gotten separated, eventually divorced. So I had moved yet again to another school with my mom where we lived on the grounds, and it was in a very poor part of town. But my mom got me into an utterly fabulous high school, so that by the time I graduated from high school, it felt like college was going to be easy.
Hmm.
Now, what about music? That was a big part of your youth and education, correct?
Yeah. So as Tzvi knows, I grew up playing music. I still play guitar every day. And I thought I was going to be a professional musician. I wanted to be a professional musician. So again, I went through high school, and I was pretty good in school. Part of it was, presumably some natural aptitudes. The other part of it was keeping my parents off my back by just keeping, very good grades. But the reality is, I wanted to be a musician. That's the only thing I really wanted to do. So I got to the end of high school. I wanted to just be done with school and start my professional music career. And my mother had this notion that felt very risky. Shocker, right? And so as the good mother that she is, she had this notion that I should go to university for a musicology degree, so that if things didn't work out, I could at least be a high school music teacher. And while I think that's a fabulous calling and career for others, it just didn't feel like the path for me. And so I basically blew out the whole framework, the whole paradigm, by buying a plane ticket behind my parents' back. And they, as I said, they were divorced. I sat them down. I asked them to have dinner with me, which hadn't happened for years, the three of us. And I announced to them at a Chinese restaurant right outside of Paris that I was leaving for LA in 2 weeks. So that's how that kind of cookie crumbled.
Did you play in any groups when you were in high school?
Yeah, so I played in, music, in bands in high school, but importantly, I grew up playing jazz.
Ah,
And so I actually played out with my mentor in Paris, and so I played in jazz clubs with my mentor, and then I played in, your kind of more traditional rock band with my classmates in high school.
great. So you got to LA.
Got to LA.
Didn't
Again, the
know
beauty
it,
of
Go
didn't
ahead.
know English, correct?
barely knew any English. I
Oh my
had I
goodness.
had and remember, this is pre-internet, so I had a book, some kind of travel book, and I had figured out how to make a reservation for 3 or 4 nights at a hostel in Hollywood, which basically meant I was a Hollywood runaway. I'd just taken a plane instead of, a bus from Kansas to get to Hollywood. And it was a very distinguished operation. It was 8 bunks to a room, so it was me and 7 of my closest friends. And I didn't know anybody. I had 3 nights. It was great. It came with breakfast included, which was a huge vat of pancake batter. So that was a promising start. But I got very lucky, and I feel like I keep getting lucky, which I'm incredibly grateful for. As I said, I had an incredible mentor in high school who taught me a lot about music, but also taught me a lot about life. And when I got to LA in that Hollywood hostel, youth hostel, I shared a bunk with a kid from Oakland, California, who was, probably 5 years older than I was at the time. So he was very mature. And he said to me, well, if you want to stay in this country, you may want to get papers. And I literally hadn't thought that far. I was just kind of checking things out. And so I ended up going to Santa Monica Community College under his advice. You know, Santa Monica College looked great to me. It turns out it's a fabulous California community college. So I started.
Well, wait. What about English? Where did the English? Did you take any in high school?
I
How
so
did
I
how did you
yeah.
go from this French-speaking emigre into into a U.S. college, which presumably teaches in English?
Yeah, so I mean, I spoke some English, broken English, and my wife will continue to make fun of me for some of the things I said then. But and look, one is I'm pretty good at languages. I spoke pretty close to fluent German in high school. I spent a lot of time in Germany as a kid, through exchange programs, that sort of thing. I spent a decent amount of time in Hamburg. I loved Hamburg, and it kind of fit my rebellious nature. uh, you know, northern Germany was probably better for me than southern Germany, we
Yeah.
shall say. So, I have some aptitude for language, but the truth is again, I think as a musician, I have an ability to hear and replicate sounds. So that's part of, um,
Right.
my acquiring the kind of English that I speak today. And then the other part of it is honestly, when I left France, I had this deep desire to just kind of shed my French identity and blend in, which at the time felt like a necessity. And now I'm
Now,
as
why was that? Why would you want to?
I don't know. You're young and you're trying to kind of move forward, and you don't know any better, so you assume that moving forward means letting go of the past. And of
Yeah.
course, I have come to conclude with the years that have gone by since that that's probably actually not the way to go. And I think you can keep adding, you can be this and that. And
Yeah.
so I've
Right.
completely reclaimed, a lot of my French culture and French heritage. And now, I think the bigger concern in my household is that, by the time I'm 80, I'll just be mumbling to myself in French, and my wife's going to be like, what the hell are you talking about?
So you want to?
Yeah, so from Santa Monica Community College, you managed to get into, I think, a scholarship to UCLA.
No. So what happened first? I mean, so I always lived because of that kid that I met at that youth hostel, had a friend who had a one bedroom, that wasn't even a one bedroom, it was a one room loft in Westwood, right outside of UCLA. So I moved to Westwood with these two guys. The kid whose apartment it was had the mezzanine, so he was pretty fancy. My friend Corey had the living room, which was a notch down, so he would sleep basically on the couch, and I was third in line, so I actually rolled out a futon in front of in the hallway in front of the door every evening. So, but I lived in Westwood. I loved Westwood, and of course Westwood is where UCLA is. So I just had this fantasy of going to UCLA. I
This
did
is
get in.
so. This is during your. I mean, I guess the community college tuition is close to free or very.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, and now we go back a little bit, so I don't want to. I remember it was $14 a unit, and that was basically for an international student. So it was de
And
facto.
how were you making any money to live on this time?
No, so I had saved
You had some savings.
yeah, so I had saved some money through high school, kind of just squirreling
Yeah.
away money because of this kind of plan I was hatching. And then by the time I got into school, I think my parents, kind of saw that I wasn't completely off the rail. So they, supported me, though it was a struggle and certainly a stretch for them financially. But Santa Monica College was very, very cheap, and as I said, I lived in a hallway, which that was not exactly high rent. I paid something like $300 a month for the privilege of rolling out a futon in front of a, a door. And then my mom's mother passed away right around the same time that I was getting into UCLA. And she had a very humble house right outside of Paris. But I believe that basically whatever money my mother cleared from her inheritance, which was, tens of thousands of dollars, it was not a lot of money. She basically used to pay for my UCLA tuition, which again was some version of 15,000 a year as an international student then, which is unbelievable. I mean, I'd kill for $15,000 tuition now. So I went to UCLA. I had fallen in love with learning at Santa Monica College. I fell in love with economics at UCLA. I had this incredible mentor, a guy by the name of Earl Thompson, who was just one, a brilliant economist, two, a wonderful human, and just taught me the importance of economics and the value of thinking economically. I took all sorts of kind of oddball classes from him, electives. One was in labor economics, another one was law and economics, smaller classes. And he was brilliant, and he was just the right amount of rebellious for my taste. Again, I prefer slightly rebellious people to slightly more establishment people.
Yeah.
That seems to be kind of a natural slant in my psyche. And Earl was amazing. So he taught me a boatload of economics. I very quickly became, a TA type of person for him. I started writing academic papers with him. This was right around the time that the tech bubble had burst. And Earl was a recovering libertarian, for lack of better description. And so he had a sincere understanding of the importance of externalities when it came to public policy. But he also was always kind of, trying to scratch the itch of trying to make sense of when economics don't behave in the classical sense of the term. And there's nothing less classical than a deeply irrational stock market bubble that bursts and just wipes out a lot of wealth. So we talked about financial economics, we talked about bubbles, we talked about the public policy part of it.
UCLA has a big reputation for historically with a lot of major figures coming out of UCLA, Alkin, and a number
Yeah.
of others.
Yeah, so Alkin, I think Earl was also a California boy, had gone to Harvard for his doctorate, and then was recruited back basically, and never left. He just again was he was truly a Los Angeles character. I mean, he walked into the classroom 20 minutes late with sunglasses and cowboy boots on, and we went on from there. So anyway, so that was my time at UCLA, and again, I couldn't be more grateful to Earl. I mean, we spent hours together every day for the couple of years that I was around, and it came time to decide what to do after undergrad. I wanted to be a professor, and the truth is, and I've as Tzvi knows, emulating mentors is a recurring theme in my life. But I say to people, I wanted to be a professor. I didn't want to be a professor. I wanted to be Earl Thompson.
Yeah.
And so I applied to grad school. I applied to UCLA because I never wanted to leave. And then in a late night conversation, possibly, with some degree of drunken stupor, the same kid who told me a few years prior, you should go to Santa Monica College for the papers, said to me, you should apply to BU. They're a private school. I bet you they've got money. And so that was the sum total of that analysis. The next morning, I paid my $60 application fee or something, and I applied to Boston University.
Wait, before we finish with college, were you able to do anything musically in those college years?
No, really not. I mean, part of it was, um,
You had to work hard.
yeah, it just, I became completely obsessed with learning, and maybe it was a simplistic understanding of what higher ed is about in the United States, but to me it was about learning as much as humanly possible. People ask me if I have friends from those years at UCLA, and sadly the answer is no, because I didn't think that was part of the equation. But I spent something like 8 hours a day at the library and 8 hours a day in Earl's office, and whatever was remaining was eating and sleeping.
Now, how did you manage to get a full tuition uh, acceptance to Boston University?
So I don't know how. I suspect we know some of the players who were involved, but it was, from my standpoint, complete luck and good fortune. So I ended up getting into UCLA for the doctoral program with no money. And I got a letter from BU that said, "Congratulations, you've been accepted." And then I flipped the page over and it said, "Oh, and by the way, you got a full presidential fellowship," which was just unbelievable to me. And so it was the first time in my life that I really made a rational, economically educated decision. I had no desire to leave Los Angeles, and I had no desire to go anywhere but UCLA. But I did the thing that was painfully obvious and the right thing to do. I moved to Boston for grad school, which of course um, ended up making my life immensely richer in a lot of ways.
So this was a PhD
It
in
was
economics,
in economics, but
in the economics department or in the
In
finance.
econ, so I was in the econ department. Again, I loved economic history. That was number one because of the work that I had done with Earl. But the thing that really got me going when I started, the doctoral program was everything having to do with microeconomics and related. I loved game theory, and I loved um, decision making under uncertainty. This, the Arrow de Breu model, and this whole concept that in a world where you don't know what's going to happen next, you're still um, burdened with having to make decisions that are going to bear out well in the future. And so I just thought that was completely brilliant. So the intersection of strategy, the game theoretical part of it, and decision making under uncertainty. And in my second or third year, Tzvi, you'll be able to correct me, I walked into the business school for an elective in finance theory, I think it was.
yeah,
And
theory.
my short version of what happened next was Tzvi took one good look at me and said, "Everything you love about economics, the thing having to do with strategic decision making and decision making under uncertainty in the real world, we call that investing. So how about you focus on finance instead?" Um, and that was very wise and insightful, wasn't it, Tzvi?
I think so. Uh, and Jonathan was the best student in the class. So naturally, uh, I was attracted to him.
Was
And
this a PhD class?
it was,
Or
yeah, it was the first class in theory for
yeah.
PhD students. And I'd give out weekly assignments. And then I'd come in on the day that they were due, and I'd say, "Jonathan, put your solution on the board."
That was what that was that. I'm not going to dispute the facts, but I think what also sealed the deal for Tzvi, and again, I do things with I I I don't believe in having a particularly tightly held plan. I think you do the right thing, you do as much of the right thing as you humanly can muster, and you see what happens. And so Tzvi had this notion, of course, that he was talking to a bunch of kind of PhD students, doctoral students, and so at some point, many of them were going to be professors, so they better learn the trade of teaching, and so I think the midterm came around, and you said, "How about everybody submit a question or two, and I'll compile the exam from all the questions I get, and that'll be the exam." And that weekend, I think I submitted something like 21 questions to the midterm.
Oh.
Just because I got going, I had another idea for another question. And so I think Tzvi concluded that it probably did make a lot of sense for me to take the exam. And so I think very quickly I was grading the tests and that sort of thing. And so that's how we started working together. First as your TA. I was replacing Shishir, who had been your TA before me. So you were, I was in the right place at the right time. There was a need, and I was the solution. But I think
Now, how did this relate? Because you're in the economics department and you're taking the business school class. How did that relationship evolve?
Well, I mean, so again, I think you'll recall that Larry Kotlikoff was the chairman of the econ department at the time, and I think Larry had a very wise view of letting students kind of follow, kind of their genius, their area of genius. So he was certainly very supportive. And then Tzvi and I just kept, becoming closer and closer and working more closely together. Again, first as TA, and then we started talking about research topics. And next thing you know, Tzvi is my advisor. And of course, we had to kind of figure out the workarounds of the fact that I was a econ student, not a finance PhD student. So Larry Kotlikoff ended up being my dissertation chair, which made a lot of sense. But yeah, we just kept talking about things that were important along the way. Tzvi said things like, "Hey, if you're gonna," and I was obviously mathematically oriented, given my interest in micro theory and game theory, and so clearly I had mathematical aptitudes. And Tzvi said, "Well, if you're kind of mathy and you really want to learn finance, I think you should go across the river and take a course from Bob Merton." And so I got on the bus. I guess that was the most efficient way to get there, to HBS, and I sat in Merton's PhD course in finance theory. I remember he taught out of the continuous finance, that black book.
HBS, by the way, stands for Harvard Business School.
So,
Right.
I mean, was there any problem in your at least auditing, or did you take the class, or?
Oh, I just sat in. There most things I do in life I don't do for credit. You know what I mean? I do for the experience and the learning. So Bob somehow was kind enough to let me sit in. I also kept quiet so that I didn't bother the people that were actually paying tuition. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot from Merton, certainly from a theoretical standpoint and how to think about the application of option theory and continuous time finance to a number of problems. At the time, there was some theological back and forth between Merton and Nassim Taleb. Nassim Taleb couldn't accept that the option pricing formula was an actual insight, and I think Merton handed us certainly handed the fee paying students an article that Taleb and Derman had written that basically said you don't need the Black-Scholes formula. All you need is something like put call parity, and I don't understand why these people are famous type of thing. And again, I went back to my jail cell. I don't know if it was my office or my tiny apartment that weekend, and I basically wrote a piece that explained why Taleb was wrong, and I submitted it to the journal. Um, and that was fun because I got accused by Nassim Taleb of basically being a front for Bob Merton. So which wasn't the case, of course. It was my original work, but that
How
was that
did
was a
he,
good time.
I mean, how did you interact with him? How did that happen?
Taleb?
Yeah,
Oh, this was all you can Google it. If you Google Merton Taleb Treussard, like this is part of the public record. I had submitted that again. I do things because I think they're the right thing to do. So I had written this piece that made sense to me. That basically, no, you actually do need, things like the Black-Scholes formula to make this work. Put call parity isn't going to do it. Submitted it to the journal. The journal.
which
I
journal?
remember.
Which,
I have no recollection. I'm.
Lee, do you
And
know
so
what journal he submitted it to?
No, I don't.
And
Okay.
so I submitted this thing. Of course, it got published because it was, a reasonable kind of like open letter kind of comeback.
No, yeah,
By then, I had become a short-term employee of a firm that Svi and Merton were involved in integrated finance. So my affiliation with kind of Merton, broadly speaking, was part of the public record. And so, I guess Taleb got upset that someone had said he was wrong about something. Though I think, by the way, Taleb is right about many things. This one I just thought he was wrong on. And I guess, playing amateur detective, recognizing that I worked for Merton, I must have just been a front. So that's, you know, that stuff is
yeah.
fun. I
I
just think it's
mean,
so good.
did he try to reply substantively?
I repeat, I think if you Google it, there'll be something that says, some version of ARG.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So anyway, that's what I did. I ended up specializing in financial theory and the application of option pricing under the tutelage of Tzvi. At BU, we wrote a good amount on two topics. Really, one is what does finance theory tell us about whether a financial product is, let's just call it a fit for purpose product, or if it's not. We talked about things like target date funds. We talked about things like, the at least the framework for thinking about the optimal creation of financial products for things like retirement. And then, of course, the application of those concepts to the non-financial sphere, to things like human capital. How do you think about career risk? And how do
yeah,
you think about, the fact that really a career, certainly a job, is an income stream. An income stream is an asset. And so when you switch from, being an engineer to a professor, what you're really doing is you're swapping one income stream for another. And so you can apply the machinery of option theory to that sort of thing.
yeah. That was fun. So your next phase was going out into the job market, I guess.
Yeah. So, and again, I the romantic version of it is I took my own advice, which is I went into industry and I actually pursued what the optimal strategy really is for most young people, which is to do the risky thing first. And God forbid the risky thing doesn't pan out. You can always fall back on the safe thing. That's the romanticized version of it. The reality, again, is um, I tend to follow my heart rather than having a strict plan. I was passionate about the application of economic theory and financial theory in an era where, the people that were recruited for top academic jobs really were empiricists. This was, I mean, I think we still live in the era of empiricists over theorists in academia. But I just didn't, really didn't get much traction on the academic job market. Fortunately, I had an extraordinarily valuable skill set in industry, namely understanding risk, understanding option theory, and this is, 2007, 2008. And so I was recruited by a guy who, I mean, and again, I feel so lucky for the people that have connected the dots for me along the way. As I said, Earl and Tzvi, and now Alec Crawford. Alec was hired by the Ziff family, an extraordinarily wealthy family in New York, to build out a more complete risk management department for their family office in early 2008. And Alec, in his infinite wisdom, concluded that having a guy who understood option theory and risk management from that perspective was worth adding to the team. So I was one of three newly minted PhDs who joined the Ziff family in the spring and summer of 2008. So I had a colleague who had just graduated from Princeton, another one from Chicago, and me. And my first day was June 15, 2008. And I remember two things from that day. I remember one of the brothers, one of the Ziff brothers, kind of walking into my office and say, you literally hop onto the credenza in my office and say, "I'm glad you're here." And I really wasn't, prepared for, the meaning and whatever, the weirdness that comes along with like hanging out with billionaires, and the fact that as a 27-year-old, you know, um, with no money to your name, so on and so forth, like it's very hard to get past the fact that a person is a person is a person is a person. And so I've really committed now to leaning into the humanity, because I think there's nothing more fundamental. It doesn't matter if you're rich, if you're poor, if you're this, if you're that, just kind of that's important to me. But the other thing that happened that day was Alec walked into my office and said, the first couple of weeks, just get used to the phone system, figure out where the pantry is, where the bathroom is. And within 2 hours of him saying, I had plenty of time to on ramp, that was over. And we were, sorting out very complex hedges for, the crisis to come. And of course, within 2 months, the crisis had arrived in full blown, and Lehman had gone under.
And had you developed hedges? Any hedges?
Yeah, we did some very good work during that
So
time.
that this family that you worked for did not suffer as much as it might have?
Well, again, the work you do for private people, you keep private, but we did some very good work during that period of time. I learned a lot. Um, and I'm just so grateful that I went through the financial crisis, in the midst of really smart people, number one. Two, there is something to be said for permanent capital. And the fact that the Ziff brothers, were in the building with us every day. And so we, a lot of people ran out of time before they ran out of money. What I mean by that is, uh, they might have had great ideas, but at some point someone says, I'm redeeming, I want my money now. And that's it. You've run out of time. We never had that problem because, the money wasn't going to leave. This was the whole purpose of the entity, was to manage the family's money.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And how was it alongside the other PhDs? And
It was great. I love both of my former colleagues. I remain in touch with one of them more closely than the other, but Julio Cachadias had just gotten his doctorate from Princeton. He had written really good theoretical stuff on contagion risk, and the fact that markets are interconnected. And so if one bad thing happens over here, then very quickly it can migrate. So he was completing that piece of the puzzle. And then Mark Klebanoff had just gotten his doctorate from Chicago. And Mark has a degree of brilliance that is rare, and he is the most well-read person I know. I mean, not only has he read every form of literature known to man, but he can also reference and quote every piece of academic literature in the last apparently 100 years. I mean, it's like, oh yeah, that's from Lerman and Bodie, 1972, third paragraph, and that's where they talk about blah. So,
Wow.
it was just this wealth of knowledge but again, it was, great people and great culture and
Do you know
just,
where he ended up going after, or did he stay?
so Mark and I are remain in close contact. He's still in New York. He now, is a mover and a shaker in the multi-manager platform hedge fund business. So if you think about the way hedge funds have evolved in the last 10, 15 years, they've gone from mostly the one manager superstar kind of program to these places like Citadel, like Millennium, like Point 72,
And what,
and
for
others.
our listeners, what do they do?
So basically, they're a talent incubator is the best way I can describe it. So a multi-manager basically has a bunch of teams. Those teams are called pods. And it's a lot like staking a bunch of teams before they go off to the casino. So a lot of these pods just don't, they're by design not talking to one another. They're by design kind of running their own strategy. And then the kind of the overarching firm is in the business of managing the managers is the best way I can describe it. So, successful teams get more money. Teams that aren't quite as successful might not have a very
Are
long
are they
future, so on
main
and so
are they
forth.
mainly or always investing in financial products, market
But I
public
mean, look,
public market products?
um, by and large, the answer is yes, but not always. But I mean, obviously the world has gone from public to private in a big way. But this is where, um, again, the tradition of things like long short market neutral strategies, kind of being long a set of stocks, short a set of stocks, that's migrated, is often in these platforms.
And do you find that your original finance theory, and of course you had experience as well, what's in your in your activity today, um, what share of, let's say, your expertise comes from uh, the finance theory side and from the experiences you've had in the markets and in various risk management positions?
Yeah, so I run Treussard Capital Management. Treussard Capital Management is a boutique wealth management firm. And the answer is I can't give you exact percentages because, of course, it's shifting. But it is shocking how much of what I do managing, private family money for
Yeah,
clients, is informed by all of it. It's interconnected. It's understanding finance theory. It's understanding risk. It's understanding that financial markets operate in a bigger construct and bigger context called society.
yeah,
It's you know, I say to people, um, liquidity is like oxygen. You don't miss it until you need it. Um, things like that. And I know that because I've seen it. So there is the theory component, which is how do you think about risk and how do you think about asymmetrical payoff structures. There is kind of the public policy or what we economists would call political economy considerations. The fact that markets are weirdly a reflection of the world, and sometimes the world is more or less friendly to the investor class. And then there is just this stuff which is along the way. You see weird things happen, and then you just kind of keep learning. So when I write a lot through my newsletter, Wealth Empowered. When I talk to people, or I always talk about three things. I talk about the mechanics of investing, I talk about the psychology of investing, and I talk about the purpose of investing. And I think that's a good way to triangulate your question, Bob, which is the mechanics is just a lot of knowledge. The psychology is really just about the fact that weird things happen. And if you don't know that weird things happen in markets, then you're very surprised when they do. But if you accept that weird things happen and you've conditioned yourself for it, then you can actually use the psychology of markets to your advantage and at least make sure that your own psychology doesn't get in the way. And then, as I said, I talk about purpose because I think purpose is fundamental to all of this. We think money is central to money management, and I just don't believe that's true. I believe purpose is central to money management. We all know as economists that these are resources designed to actually help you achieve your goals through time and space.
Do you have any familiarity with the way finance is practiced in Europe, in France, maybe England? Do you have any thoughts or knowledge about that?
So the answer is, I mean, so I for a period of time, for a number of years, I was partner and head of product management at Research Affiliates. Research Affiliates is about $150 billion around the world, asset manager, and a lot of it through partnerships in Europe. So I spent a lot of time in London, working with asset managers and in Paris to some degree. The answer is, I mean, particularly the English system is reasonably close to the U.S. system when it comes to kind of the plumbing of finance and all of that. And, I think to some degree they're let's just say that for a period of time they were probably a little bit more sophisticated on things like hedge funds, and for a period of time they were probably a little bit behind the eight ball on things like ETFs. But fundamentally, the UK system looks a lot like certainly the kind of the London centric system looks a lot like the US centric system when it comes to finance. But I think it actually speaks to a thing that I know Tzvi has written about a lot in the past, which is the functions of economics and the functions of finance. Things like, again, moving resources through time and space. We got to do it, right? And then the question is, how do we organize ourselves to get it done? And weirdly, and this is where I think, again, I'm not a classical economist because I think institutions really do matter. Let's just call it the Anglo-Saxon system, have put money and markets at the middle of this. And so are you surprised that we are money and market centered? The French have the same requirements. They have to move money through time and space to fund hopes, dreams, retirements, everything in between. But they didn't put money and markets at the middle of it, at the center of it. So that each geography will have kind of slightly different flavors to it. I don't like, good luck trying to, run a thriving ETF business in continental Europe. That's just not the way people think about kind of investing. But nonetheless, it's the same idea.
Tzvi, what are some questions you might want to?
Well, Jonathan has, although he hasn't become a professor of finance, he has definitely taught finance, and he might want to say something about the teaching that he's doing now.
Yeah. So, by the way, you're right. Once a teacher, always a teacher, right, Tzvi? So,
Right.
One of the things that I love about running my own firm now, Treussard Capital Management, is, unlike working for an extraordinarily wealthy family, where in a lot of ways your job is to kind of stay under the radar, or to work in asset management, where inherently there are commercial commercial impetus behind your writing. I get to write, I get to educate, I get to speak to what I believe is going on in markets, what I believe is going on in the asset management industry, in a way that is really designed to be educational, and that's why I call my newsletter Wealth Empowered. So I feel like I've never really stopped teaching. It's just kind of the platform. But recently, I was actually approached by the University of California, Irvine, to teach behavioral finance over this past summer, and that was a huge amount of fun to be kind of back in the classroom in front of 50 master's level students. But it was also a huge amount of fun because of the topic. I really do think that behavioral finance is thoroughly central to understanding how to get this right. And what I mean by that is you can be painfully smart at the mechanics of market, but if you don't master the psychology of markets and have a clear understanding of your own psychology, then you're setting yourself up for a lot of tears. And so that was fun. I really enjoyed teaching behavioral finance this past summer.
Well, I actually was going to ask you about the behavioral economics. Let's say I don't want to call it a fad, but a development. And I know that, or I think that some people in finance have been quite skeptical and others more accepting. It happens
I
that both Zvi and I have had relations with the two pioneers, Kahneman and Tversky, that were not economists, but played a big role in this development. But do you think there's now more of a synthesis, or is there still this kind of split?
I I think there's a split because I think there's a split on a couple of fronts, but one is um, when you're in the business of selling things, whether they're products, investment products, or ideas, um, you're weirdly you become a caricature of your own messaging. And so I think if you've been a classical economist, or if you've been selling products that are predicated on everything is a risk premium, surely there can be no psychology here, then you find yourself, you kind of talk, you're backed into a corner. And so I think people just um, get stuck. So I think that's part of it. But I will tell you this: I think you look at markets and you live in markets, and you're bound to come to the conclusion that very important mechanical things are at play all the time. As I said, liquidity is very real.
Yeah,
Valuations are very real, and um, psychology is also very real. I don't know how you explain, just over the course of let's just, we don't need to go back to antediluvian times. I don't know how you explain the tech bubble without behavioral finance. And by the way, when I talk to my students about behavioral finance, I talk a lot about career risk, which is,
yeah,
hey, like if you're just trying to survive as an asset manager, like you can't stand in the way of these mass movements for very long. I mean, people, had to close up shop because they said, mark my words, the NASDAQ can't go any higher. And of course it did. And, all of that. So um, whether it's, things like the tech bubble, um, the meme fad of, the recent past, everything in between, the rise of crypto,
yeah,
um, every part of this, the sheer I don't know what to call it. It's more than panic. It was just existential black hole that we found ourselves in the middle of the financial crisis. I mean, all of that is human psychology. It has very little to do with classical economics.
Zvi, would you want to weigh in?
Well, I'm a believer that behavioral economics and finance are an integral part of the science of finance today. There are lots of uh, not practitioners, there's lots of financial scholars who believe in it, do research. So I personally have not contributed anything to that literature, but uh, I see its value.
Yeah.
Now, before we let Jonathan go, there's one thing that we have not said that needs to be said, which is Jonathan is my son-in-law, and he is the father of two granddaughters of mine.
And
And
that's, yeah,
he's doing a good job.
we try, Tzvi. We try.
Yeah.
And that's, again, I think that's one of those things where I repeat, I don't believe in having much of a plan. You just kind of keep doing the right thing and you see where that takes you. Um, and the other thing that I'm a sincere believer in is just do as much of that as humanly possible. So not to link parenting um, to preparing exams, but if I'm going to be turning in 21 questions instead of one, then I will bring the same amount of intensity and passion to trying and help these extraordinary kids be the most incredible version of themselves they can be. And so I do that for them. I do that for us. I do that for you, Tzvi and Judy, and we just I think we're all in awe of these kids. But my job is to lean in real hard.
And I noticed, having been out to attend their bat mitzvahs, this nice sense of community that you seem to have been a part of and have, I don't know, lucked into.
This is where I think there's some luck, but this is again where I'll give a lot of credit to my wife Mariah, Tzvi's daughter, and she's taught me a lot about the value of community, of the fact that it doesn't just happen, that you have to kind of lean in and make it happen. Um, so yeah, we have an incredible community. I feel very fortunate in this regard, but I don't think it's luck. I think it's commitment and intensity and in I don't know in nurturing it in I again I look, I grew up in Paris. I lived in LA and Boston and New York, mostly kind of large cities that if not promote, then lead to a sense that anonymity is the natural state. And layer on top of that, being an immigrant where I think there's some degree of stranger danger. And so I was always very much protective or whatever, not. And yeah, Mariah's taught me the value of community. And so I love that. I just want more. I want to be, I talked about humanity earlier. And I think that's all it is like lean into the humanity of it all, of the people around you. And life is just richer for it.
Well, that's a great place to close. Jonathan, we thank you very much. You're still in the middle of your career. Maybe in 15 years, we'll have a second interview about the rest of the arc of your career, but we've enjoyed learning so much. And thank you for being part of Ideas and Lives. And as Svi would remind us to say,
Sei gesund.
sei gesund.
It was fabulous, you guys.
Okay.